They checked in, but they never checked out. In the winter of 1891, the Ashcroft Hotel became a tomb disguised as sanctuary. Before we dive into this chilling tale from the frozen heart of Vermont, tell us, where are you listening from right now? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you're ready to uncover the darkest corners of history with us, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happened inside those walls. Now let's step back in time, to a place where warmth was a lie and hospitality was a mask for something unspeakable. The winter of 1891 descended upon Vermont like a curse from the heavens themselves. By mid-December, the roads were buried under 3 feet of snow, and the wind howled through the pine forests with a voice that sounded almost human. The small town of Ridgefield, nestled in the northern mountains, had become an island unto itself, cut off from the rest of civilization by the relentless storm that seemed to have no end. It was during this merciless season that the Ashcroft Hotel stood as a beacon of hope. Built just 2 years prior by a mysterious investor from Boston, a man named Cornelius Ashcroft, the 3-story structure rose from the landscape like a cathedral of wood and stone. Its architecture was distinctly Victorian, with ornate trimwork, tall windows that glowed amber in the darkness, and a wraparound porch that promised shelter from the elements. The hotel's main entrance was flanked by 2 gas lamps that burned day and night, their flames dancing behind frosted glass. Inside, a massive stone fireplace dominated the lobby, its fire perpetually fed by unseen hands. The scent of burning cedar mixed with something else, something faintly medicinal that guests couldn't quite identify, but found oddly comforting. Thomas Whitmore arrived at the Ashcroft on December 18th, his stagecoach nearly overturned by the violent winds. He was a traveling salesman from Albany, his cases filled with patent medicines and tonics. His fingers were blue with cold, his beard crusted with ice, and his faith in survival had dwindled to almost nothing when he finally stumbled through the hotel's heavy oak doors. "Thank God," he gasped, collapsing against the registration desk. "I thought I'd freeze to death out there." The desk clerk was a thin man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. His name was Frederick Hayes, though he rarely introduced himself. He simply smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and pushed the leather-bound guest registry across the polished mahogany surface. "You're fortunate to have found us, Mr. Whitmore," Frederick said softly, somehow already knowing his name, despite Thomas never having mentioned it. "The storm has been particularly cruel this season." Thomas was too exhausted to question how the clerk knew his identity. He signed the registry with numb fingers, noting that only 3 other names appeared on the page for that week. Strange, he thought, for a hotel of this size in such a remote location. Surely more travelers would have sought refuge here. "Room 207, Frederick announced, sliding an iron key across the desk. "Second floor, end of the eastern corridor. Dinner is served at 7 in the dining room. I trust you'll find everything satisfactory." The way he emphasized that last word made Thomas's skin prickle, but he attributed it to exhaustion and cold. He hauled his cases up the wide staircase, noting how quiet the hotel was. No voices, no footsteps, no creaking floorboards except his own. The hallways were lit by wall sconces that cast dancing shadows, making the floral wallpaper seem to move in ways that defied the stillness of the air. Room 207 was larger than expected, furnished with a brass bed, a writing desk, and a window that looked out over the endless white expanse of the valley below. Thomas noticed the window was sealed shut, painted over multiple times as if to ensure it would never open. He found this odd, but reasoned it was to keep out the cold. That evening, he made his way to the dining room, following the smell of roasted meat and baked bread. The space was elegant, crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, fine china, but eerily empty, except for one other guest. A woman sat at a corner table, her posture rigid, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features. She didn't look up when Thomas entered, didn't acknowledge his presence at all. She simply stared at her untouched plate, her hands folded in her lap. "Good evening," Thomas offered, taking a seat at a table near the fireplace. The woman didn't respond. It was as if she hadn't heard him, or perhaps as if he didn't exist at all. A server appeared from the kitchen, another thin, pale individual with that same hollow look in his eyes. He placed a plate before Thomas without a word. Venison, potatoes, green beans. The food was hot, well prepared and strangely tasteless. Thomas ate mechanically, feeling the weight of the woman's silence pressing against the room like a physical presence. "Excuse me," he called to the server. "How long has that woman been a guest here?" The server paused, his expression unchanging. "I'm not at liberty to discuss other guests, sir. Is there anything else you require?" No, thank you." After dinner, Thomas returned to his room, exhaustion pulling him towards sleep, despite the unease that had settled in his chest. He didn't notice the small detail that would haunt him later. The registry downstairs now showed 4 names for the week, but when he'd signed in, there had been only 3. And yet, he'd encountered only one other guest. As he drifted off, the wind outside intensified, rattling the sealed window. And somewhere in the depths of the hotel, footsteps echoed through empty corridors, measured, deliberate, and moving ever closer to the occupied rooms. Thomas woke to absolute silence. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, oppressive. The storm had stopped sometime during the night, but the absence of wind only made the hotel's stillness more pronounced. He checked his pocket watch. 6:47 a.m. The morning light filtering through his sealed window was grey and weak, casting the room in shades of ash. He dressed quickly, his breath visible in the cold air despite the radiator in the corner supposedly pumping heat. When he touched the metal surface, it was ice cold. Puzzled, he made his way downstairs, hoping to speak with someone about getting his room properly heated. The lobby was empty. No clerk at the desk, no guests milling about, no staff preparing for the day. The fire in the great hearth had burned down to embers, though no one appeared to tend to it. Thomas approached the registration desk, intending to ring the service bell, when his eyes fell upon the open registry. His blood ran cold. The page showed entries from the past month, names written in various hands and inks. But as Thomas scanned the columns, he noticed something deeply disturbing. Dozens of check-in dates, but almost no corresponding check-out dates. Guest after guest had signed in, some as recently as 3 days ago, but the departure column remained blank. Page after page, the same pattern repeated itself. "Looking for something, Mr. Whitmore?" Thomas spun around to find Frederick Hayes standing behind him, seemingly materialized from nowhere. The clerk's smile was the same as before, pleasant, empty, vaguely threatening. I was just curious about the other guests," Thomas stammered. "I've barely seen anyone since I arrived, for such a large hotel." "We value privacy here," Frederick interrupted smoothly. "Our guests appreciate discretion. Many come to the Ashcroft specifically for solitude. The isolation allows for reflection. But surely some of these people have families, businesses to return to. Don't they need to leave eventually?" Frederick's smile widened slightly, though his eyes remained flat and lifeless. "The Ashcroft has a way of making people feel quite at home, Mr. Whitmore. So much so that many extend their stays, indefinitely in some cases." The way he said indefinitely made Thomas's stomach turn. He wanted to press further, to demand answers about the registry's impossible pattern, but something in Frederick's gaze warned him against it. Instead, he nodded stiffly and retreated to the dining room for breakfast. The same woman from the previous night sat in the exact same position at the corner table, wearing the same dress, staring at an untouched plate of food. Thomas approached her cautiously. "Ma'am, are you all right?" For the first time, she looked up at him. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, as if she were looking through him at something far away. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, cracked and hollow. "Don't eat the food." "I beg your pardon?" "The food," she repeated, her hands beginning to tremble. "Something in the food makes you tired, makes you stay." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "What's your name? How long have you been here?" "Martha. Martha Henley. I came 3 weeks ago. Meant to stay 2 nights. But I can't seem to—" Her voice trailed off, and her eyes glazed over once more, returning to their vacant stare. Thomas backed away slowly, his mind racing. He looked down at his own breakfast plate, eggs, bacon, toast. And suddenly, the memory of last night's tasteless dinner took on sinister meaning. He left the food untouched and hurried back to his room, his heart pounding. He needed to leave, immediately. But when he tried his door, the key wouldn't turn. The lock had somehow become jammed or altered. After several minutes of struggling, the door finally opened. But inside his room, something had changed. His cases had been moved, subtly repositioned, and on his bed lay a fresh change of clothes. Clothes he'd never seen before, but that were exactly his size. A note rested on top of the garments, written in elegant script. "Please join us for dinner at 7 p.m. Your presence is requested in the private dining room. 2nd floor, western corridor." Thomas crumpled the note, fear rising in his throat like bile. He went to the window, intending to break it if necessary, but the glass was impossibly thick, the paint sealing it reinforced with something beneath the surface. He struck it with the wooden chair, and the chair splintered while the window remained intact. He was trapped. That evening, as 7 o'clock approached, Thomas heard footsteps in the hallway outside his room. Slow, measured footsteps that stopped directly outside his door. A gentle knock followed. "Mr. Whitmore," came Frederick's voice, muffled by the wood. "Dinner is served. Please don't keep Mr. Ashcroft waiting." Thomas's breath caught. Cornelius Ashcroft, the hotel's mysterious owner who supposedly lived in Boston, was here. Against every instinct screaming at him to barricade the door, curiosity and a desperate hope for answers compelled Thomas to open it. Frederick stood in the hallway, flanked by 2 other staff members Thomas had never seen before. All 3 wore the same vacant expression, the same hollow-eyed gaze. "This way, please," Frederick said, gesturing down the western corridor. Thomas followed, his mind cataloguing every detail, searching for escape routes. The corridor seemed longer than it should be, the doors on either side all identical, all silent. At the end stood a pair of double doors, ornately carved with patterns that seemed to writhe in the flickering gaslight. Frederick opened the doors. Inside, a long dining table stretched beneath a glittering chandelier, and seated at the head of the table, immaculately dressed in a black suit, was a man Thomas instinctively knew was Cornelius Ashcroft himself. But it was the other seats that made Thomas's blood freeze. Every chair was occupied by a guest, men and women of various ages, all dressed formally, all sitting perfectly still with empty plates before them. Their eyes were open but unseeing, their faces slack, their bodies unnaturally rigid. They looked less like dinner guests and more like carefully posed mannequins, and among them Thomas recognized faces from the registry downstairs, people who had checked in weeks, even months ago. "Welcome, Mr. Whitmore," Cornelius Ashcroft said, his voice smooth and cultured. "I do hope you'll stay for dinner. We have so much to discuss about your extended residency at my establishment." Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes moving from one catatonic guest to another. The chandelier above cast sharp shadows across their faces, making them appear almost skull-like in the dim light. Cornelius Ashcroft remained seated at the head of the table, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, studying Thomas with the analytical gaze of a collector examining a new acquisition. "Please sit," Ashcroft said, gesturing to an empty chair midway down the table between a middle-aged man in a conductor's uniform and a young woman in a traveling dress. There's no need for alarm. This is merely a dinner party. A dinner party. Thomas's voice came out strangled. These people they're not even conscious. What have you done to them? Ashcroft's expression didn't change. I've provided them with something they couldn't find anywhere else in this cruel world. Permanent refuge, eternal shelter from the storms outside. Isn't that what everyone truly wants, Mr. Whitmore? A place where they never have to face the cold again? Thomas took a careful step backward, but Frederick and the other staff members blocked his retreat, their bodies forming an impassable wall. He was trapped between the catatonic guests and the servants who'd become something less than human themselves. Sit, Ashcroft repeated, his tone hardening. I insist. With no other option, Thomas moved to the indicated chair and lowered himself onto it, his muscles tense, ready to flee at the first opportunity. The woman beside him didn't blink, didn't breathe visibly. Up close, he could see that her skin had taken on a waxy quality, as if she were slowly transforming into something else entirely. Ashcroft smiled, seeming pleased by Thomas's compliance. You're wondering what's happening here. That's natural. You're more perceptive than most who arrive at my establishment. The woman in the dining room, Martha Henley, I believe, she warned you, didn't she, about the food? Thomas said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. She was correct, of course, Ashcroft continued, lifting a crystal glass filled with dark red wine. The meals here are prepared with certain additives, herbal extracts from plants that grow only in the deepest parts of these mountains. Indigenous peoples used them in sacred rituals centuries ago, before they were driven out or exterminated. The compounds induce a state of profound suggestibility, followed by deep lethargy, and eventually, a kind of waking coma. Why? Thomas managed to ask. Why do this? What do you gain from keeping people here like prisoners? Ashcroft's smile faded, replaced by something that might have been genuine emotion, though whether it was sadness, anger, or something else entirely, Thomas couldn't tell. Prisoners? Ashcroft said softly. No, Mr. Whitmore. Residents. Permanent residents of the only place that will never abandon them, never turn them away. Do you know what this hotel really is? It's an ark, a sanctuary for those the world has forgotten or discarded. He stood, walking slowly along the length of the table, his hand trailing across the backs of the chairs. This man here, Mr. Donovan, was a train conductor who lost his family to scarlet fever. He came here with a rope in his bag, intending to end his life in some anonymous room. This woman, Miss Carpenter, was fleeing an abusive husband who'd already killed 2 wives before her. That gentleman at the far end, Dr. Reeves, was wanted for mercy killings at a hospital in Boston. Each person here was running from something, seeking refuge from a world too harsh to endure. So you drugged them? Thomas shot back. Made them into living corpses. I gave them peace, Ashcroft corrected coldly. I gave them a place where the pain stops, where the fear ends, where they can exist without suffering. The alternative for most of them was death, either by their own hand or by the cruelty of others. I simply offered a third option. Thomas's mind raced, trying to process the twisted logic. And the staff, Frederick and the others, what happened to them? They were the first, Ashcroft admitted. When I built this hotel, I hired locals from Ridgefield. But they began asking too many questions about the guests who never left. So I offered them the same mercy I offer everyone else. Now they serve without complaint, without fear, without the burdens of consciousness that plague ordinary men. You're insane, Thomas whispered. Perhaps, Ashcroft conceded, but I'm also providing a service. Every winter, when the storms isolate this region, desperate people arrive at my door. I take them in, I feed them, I house them, and if they're truly broken, truly beyond hope, I offer them something the outside world never could, an end to their suffering without the finality of death. He returned to his seat at the head of the table, his eyes boring into Thomas. "The question now, Mr. Whitmore, is what category do you fall into? Are you simply a traveler who will continue on his way once the snow melts? Or are you someone who might benefit from extended hospitality?" Thomas's hands gripped the arms of his chair. "I'm leaving. Tomorrow. As soon as possible." "Are you?" Ashcroft's smile returned, cold and knowing. "You've already eaten 2 meals here, Mr. Whitmore. The compounds are cumulative. By now they're in your bloodstream, beginning their work. You probably noticed the fatigue, the slight confusion, the way time seems to move differently in this place. That's the beginning of the process." Thomas felt panic rising in his chest. It was true. He did feel strange, his thoughts slightly clouded, his reactions slower than they should be. There must be an antidote, something to reverse it. "There is," Ashcroft said. "Fresh air, physical exertion, and time away from this place. The compounds metabolize slowly in isolated conditions, but can be purged from the system with effort. The question is whether you have the strength left to make that effort, or whether you'll simply stay." He gestured to the guests around the table. Some resisted at first, like you. They tried to leave, tried to break free, but the combinations of the compounds, the isolation, the comfort of a warm bed, and regular meals. Eventually, resistance becomes too difficult. It's easier to simply accept, to let go, to stay. Thomas pushed himself up from the chair, his legs trembling. "I won't. I'll find a way out of here." "Perhaps," Ashcroft said, seemingly unconcerned. "The doors aren't locked, Mr. Whitmore. You're free to walk out into the snow at any time. Of course, the nearest town is 15 miles away through chest-deep drifts. The temperature tonight will drop to 20 below zero, and you haven't eaten proper food without additives, in 2 days. Your strength is already compromised." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "But please, make the attempt if you wish. I won't stop you. This has always been about choice, after all. Some people choose to leave. Most choose to stay. Let's see which category you belong to." Thomas stumbled toward the door, his vision beginning to blur at the edges. Frederick and the other staff members stepped aside, allowing him to pass. Behind him, Cornelius Ashcroft's voice followed, echoing in the hallway. "Your room will be waiting when you realize there's nowhere else to go. There's always a place for you here at the Ashcroft, Mr. Whitmore. Always and forever." Thomas crashed through the hallway, his hands scraping against the floral wallpaper as he fought to maintain balance. His head felt heavy, thoughts sluggish and disjointed. How much of the compound was in his system? How much time did he have before he became like the others, hollow-eyed, vacant, trapped in a waking dream? He had to get out. Now. The main staircase seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the steps multiplying in his distorted vision. He gripped the banister and forced himself downward, each movement requiring conscious effort. Behind him, he could hear nothing, no footsteps pursuing, no voices calling out. The hotel's silence was complete, as if it were holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. The lobby materialized around him like a memory struggling to surface. The fire in the great hearth had burned down to nothing, leaving the space cold and shadowed. Thomas staggered to the main entrance, his hands fumbling with the heavy door's brass handle. It opened. Ashcroft hadn't lied. The doors weren't locked. The realization was somehow more terrifying than if they had been, because it meant the hotel's true prison wasn't physical. It was psychological, chemical, insidious. The night air hit him like a physical blow. The cold was absolute, searingly painful against his exposed skin. Snow stretched in every direction, unmarked and pristine under a moonless sky. The world beyond the hotel's porch was an endless void of white and black, hostile and unknowable. Thomas stepped off the porch and immediately sank to his knees in snow. His thin clothing, the clothes he'd packed for business travel, not Arctic survival, offered almost no protection. The wind had picked up again, cutting through fabric like it wasn't there, finding every inch of exposed skin and burning it with cold. He pushed forward anyway, driven by terror and determination. 15 miles to Ridgefield, 15 miles through this. He could make it. He had to make it. But with each step, his strength waned. The compounds in his system, combined with 2 days of inadequate nutrition and the sheer physical exhaustion of forcing his body through the deep snow, began to take their toll. His legs trembled, his lungs burned with each breath of frozen air, and his thoughts became increasingly fragmented. After what felt like hours, but could only have been minutes, he turned to look back at the hotel. It stood behind him, glowing warmly in the darkness, its windows lit like beacons promising safety and shelter. He'd barely covered 100 yards. The building seemed to be watching him, patient and eternal, knowing he would return. "No," he gasped aloud, his voice lost in the wind. "I won't go back." He forced himself forward again, but his body was shutting down, redirecting resources away from his extremities to protect his core. His fingers had gone numb, his toes no longer sent signals to his brain. The cold wasn't painful anymore. It was becoming a kind of numbness, a creeping anesthesia that made the idea of simply lying down in the snow seem almost appealing. That's when he saw it, a light in the distance flickering between the trees. Not the hotel behind him, but something ahead. Another building? A cabin? Hope surged through him, providing a final burst of energy. He angled toward the light, his movements becoming more desperate, less controlled. But as he drew closer, his hope curdled into horror. It wasn't a cabin. It was a small shed, half buried in snow, and the light came from a lantern hanging on a post beside it. And around the shed, visible even through the falling snow, were shapes, human shapes, bodies. Thomas fell to his knees, crawling the final distance. The corpses were frozen solid, preserved by the brutal cold, arranged in neat rows like cordwood. Some were clearly from decades past, their clothing old-fashioned even by 1891 standards. Others were more recent, their faces still retaining enough detail for Thomas to recognize several from the hotel's registry. These were the ones who had tried to leave. The ones who had made it further than the hotel's front porch, but not far enough to survive. The ones who had chosen death in the snow over life in Ashcroft's mercy. A metal plaque was mounted on the shed's wall, and Thomas crawled close enough to read it by the lantern's light. The Ashcroft Memorial Garden. These souls rest in eternal peace, having found their final refuge. The twisted benevolence of it, the idea that Ashcroft had collected and preserved even those who had rejected his hospitality, made Thomas's stomach heave. He vomited into the snow, his body purging what little he had left. He was going to die out here. He could feel it now, his core temperature dropping, his consciousness beginning to flicker like a candle in wind. The compound in his system made it harder to fight, harder to care about survival. Part of him wanted to simply close his eyes and let the cold take him. At least then he wouldn't become one of Ashcroft's permanent residents, another vacant-eyed prisoner at the eternal dinner table. But then he heard something, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the night. Voices, human voices calling out, "Over here! I see someone!" Light pierced the darkness, stronger than the shed's single lantern. Torches. Multiple torches, carried by multiple people. "It's another one! He's still alive!" Rough hands grabbed Thomas, lifting him from the snow. His vision swam, but he could make out faces, real faces, with genuine concern and fear and humanity in them. Not the hollow masks of Ashcroft's servants. "We've got you," a gruff voice said. "Hold on, we'll get you to town." "The hotel," Thomas managed to gasp. "People, trapped, drugged." "We know," the voice replied grimly. "We know." As consciousness faded, Thomas felt himself being carried away from the shed, away from the hotel's glowing windows, toward safety. His last thought before darkness claimed him was a question. How did they know to find him? How did they know about the hotel? And in the distance, barely visible through the snow, he saw a figure standing on the Ashcroft's porch, watching the rescue party disappear into the night. Even from this distance, Thomas recognized the silhouette of Cornelius Ashcroft, patient and untroubled, knowing that for everyone who escaped, a dozen more would come seeking refuge from the storm. Thomas woke to warmth and light. For a terrifying moment he thought he was back in the hotel, that his escape had been a fevered dream and he'd simply collapsed in the hallway, only to be carried back to his room by Frederick's cold hands. But the smell was different, wood smoke and coffee instead of that odd medicinal scent, and the sounds were different too, genuine conversation, a fire crackling naturally, footsteps that had weight and purpose. He opened his eyes to find himself in a small cabin, lying on a cot near a pot-bellied stove. 3 men sat at a rough-hewn table nearby, speaking in low voices. When they noticed Thomas stirring, one of them, a bearded man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors, approached. "Easy now," the man said, his voice the same gruff tone Thomas remembered from the rescue. "You took in a lot of cold. Lucky we found you when we did. Another hour and you'd be as frozen as the others." "Who are you?" Thomas croaked, his throat raw. "Name's Samuel Barrett. I'm the sheriff of Ridgefield. These are my deputies, Jacob and William. We've been watching the Ashcroft Hotel for 3 months now, ever since people started disappearing." Thomas struggled to sit up, and Samuel helped him, propping pillows behind his back. "Disappearing? Then you know what's happening there? You know about Ashcroft?" Samuel's expression darkened. "We know some of it, not all. Getting information about that place is like trying to grab smoke. People check in but don't check out. Those who do manage to leave, like you, are usually half-mad or too traumatized to speak coherently, and we can't just storm the place without cause." "Without cause." Thomas's voice rose in disbelief. "There are people being held there, drugged, turned into living corpses." "We know," Jacob interjected from the table, his younger face tight with frustration. "But Ashcroft is careful. Technically, everyone who stays at his hotel does so voluntarily. He doesn't kidnap people or force them in at gunpoint. They walk through his doors of their own free will, and if they're being drugged with something that doesn't kill them, doesn't leave obvious marks." "We have no legal grounds for action," Samuel finished bitterly. "We've contacted authorities in Montpellier, even sent word to Boston, where Ashcroft supposedly comes from. But there's no record of Cornelius Ashcroft existing before 1889. No birth certificate, no business records, no property deeds beyond the hotel itself. It's as if he materialized out of nothing 2 years ago, with enough money to build that monstrosity and enough knowledge of chemistry to create his compounds." Thomas's mind reeled. "The bodies, the shed. I saw at least 20 corpses." 37, William said quietly. "We've counted them. We check every week and the number keeps growing. But even that doesn't give us legal standing. They all died of exposure, technically. People who tried to leave the hotel during storms and didn't make it. Ashcroft could argue he tried to stop them, tried to keep them safe, and they left against his advice." "That's insane," Thomas protested. "That's the law," Samuel replied, sitting down heavily on a chair beside the cot. "Or at least the letter of it. But we're not giving up. We've been documenting everything, building a case. Your testimony will help. If we can prove that Ashcroft is deliberately drugging guests with the intent to hold them against their will, we might be able to get the state attorney general involved." Thomas nodded. Then a thought struck him. "How did you find me? How did you know I was there?" Samuel exchanged glances with his deputies before answering. "We watched the hotel from a distance. We've set up observation points in the woods around it. When we saw you leave and start heading toward the memorial shed, we knew you'd need help. We've lost people before, people who tried to escape but didn't understand how far they'd have to go or how depleted their bodies were. We've been too late for 6 others, Jacob added, his voice heavy with guilt. You're the second person we've managed to save. The first was a young woman named Charlotte Pierce. She's recovering in town, but her mind, she's not the same. Something about what happened in that hotel broke something inside her. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with his recent exposure. Martha Henley. There's a woman in the hotel, Martha Henley. She warned me about the food. She's been there for 3 weeks. If there's any chance, we'll add her to the list, Samuel promised. But Thomas, you need to understand something. We can't raid that hotel. Not yet. Not without more evidence, more testimony, more political will from people with power. Right now, all we can do is watch, document, and try to save the ones who managed to escape. And meanwhile, how many more people check in? Thomas demanded. How many more travelers seek shelter there and never leave? This has to stop. It will, Samuel said firmly, but it has to be done right. If we go in half-cocked and the legal system throws out the case, Ashcroft walks free and probably disappears, only to set up somewhere else. We need to build a case so airtight that even the most corrupt judge couldn't dismiss it. Over the next 3 days, Thomas remained in the cabin, recovering his strength and giving detailed testimony about everything he'd witnessed. Samuel wrote it all down carefully, adding it to a growing file of evidence. During that time, Thomas learned more about the investigation. The Ashcroft Hotel had opened in March of 1889 during the tail end of that year's winter. From the beginning, locals had found something unsettling about it, though they couldn't articulate exactly what. Cornelius Ashcroft kept to himself, rarely came to town, and hired staff through newspaper advertisements rather than local recruitment. The first disappearance, a traveling salesman named Robert Morrison, occurred in November of 1889. His brother had filed a missing person report, claiming Robert had sent a letter saying he'd arrived at the Ashcroft but had never been heard from since. We investigated, Samuel explained. Ashcroft showed us the registry. Morrison had checked in and checked out 3 days later. He even produced a signed receipt for the bill. There was nothing we could do. But the disappearances continued. By the winter of 1890, 8 people had vanished after staying at the hotel. Some had families who reported them missing. Others had nobody to notice they were gone. The pattern only became clear in retrospect, when Samuel started comparing notes from different jurisdictions and realized all the missing people had last been seen heading toward or staying at the Ashcroft. That's when we started watching the place, Samuel said. And that's when we found the memorial shed and the bodies. We wanted to confront Ashcroft then, but the state authorities told us to wait to build a more comprehensive case. They're concerned about jurisdiction issues, about Ashcroft having political connections we don't know about. So people keep dying while bureaucrats deliberate, Thomas said bitterly. Yes, Samuel admitted, his face anguished, and it eats at us every day. But if we act rashly and fail, we might never get another chance to stop him. On the 4th day, Thomas was strong enough to travel. Samuel arranged for him to take a coach to Burlington, where he could catch a train back to Albany. Before he left, the sheriff gave him a final warning. Ashcroft knows your face now. If you ever come back to this part of Vermont, be careful. We don't know the full extent of his connections or resources. Some of my contacts suggest he might not be working alone, that there might be others like him operating similar establishments elsewhere. The implication made Thomas's blood run cold. You think there are more places like the Ashcroft? I think, Samuel said carefully, that what we're dealing with is more organized than one madman with knowledge of herbal compounds. But I can't prove it. Not yet. Thomas left Ridgefield with a promise to testify when called upon, to help bring Ashcroft to justice no matter how long it took. But as his coach carried him away from those mountains, away from the hotel that still glowed in the darkness like a predator's eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd only glimpsed the edge of something far larger and more terrible. Months later, in April of 1892, Thomas received a telegram from Samuel Barrett. The message was brief. Hotel closed. Building empty. Ashcroft gone, all evidence removed, case suspended. Thomas never returned to Vermont. He moved to California, changed his name, and spent the rest of his life trying to forget the Ashcroft Hotel. But sometimes on the coldest winter nights, he would wake from dreams of endless hallways and vacant eyes, of a dinner table filled with the living dead, and of a voice promising eternal refuge from the storm. The Ashcroft Hotel's building stood empty for 7 years before being destroyed by fire in 1899. The memorial shed and its contents disappeared sometime during that period, removed by persons unknown. No official investigation into the hotel's activities was ever completed. Cornelius Ashcroft was never found, never charged, never held accountable. But in the decades that followed, similar stories emerged from isolated regions across America. Hotels, boarding houses, and inns where travelers checked in during harsh winters and were never seen again. Places where the promise of shelter hid something darker, where hospitality was a mask for something unspeakable. The Ashcroft Hotel was closed, but its legacy remained. And somewhere, perhaps, Cornelius Ashcroft continued his work, offering permanent refuge to those desperate enough to accept it, building his collection of permanent residents, one vanished soul at a time. Thomas Whitmore took his knowledge to the grave in 1931, never speaking of that winter again, except once, in a delirious fever at the end of his life, when he whispered to his daughter, "Never stay at a hotel that's too welcoming. Never trust shelter that feels too much like home. Because some places don't want you to leave, they want you to stay, forever and always." The Ashcroft Hotel is gone, but the mountains of Vermont remain, and in those mountains, on the coldest winter nights, travelers sometimes see lights in the distance, warm, welcoming lights that promise safety from the storm. And some of those travelers, desperate and frozen and without anywhere else to go, follow those lights into the darkness. They check in, but they never check out. If this story sent chills down your spine, imagine what else we have in store. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because history's darkest corners are waiting to be explored, and you won't want to miss a single shadow. Drop a comment telling us, would you have tried to escape the Ashcroft, or would the promise of warmth and shelter have been too tempting to resist? See you in the next story, if you dare.